Hello and welcome to this special episode of Governance This Week. My name is Fabrizio Tassinari and I'm the Executive Director of the School of Transnational Governance. And we are very honored and pleased today to welcome a champion of Africa and of its development, Sir Mo Ibrahim, here at the school and at Governance This Week. Dr. Ibrahim is the founder and chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. He has a long and distinguished business career before that, and he's coming here to Florence today to be the holder of the distinguished Lapira Lecture on Dialogue of Civilizations, which we host every year with a long list of distinguished speakers in its name. And welcome, Mo, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And we will talk today a lot about Africa, Europe-Africa relations, and the need for, as you put it, a reset and the need to rethink this relationship. And I would like us to start off with a very basic question to get us all on the same page, which is really the state of play, the current landscape in Africa in terms of growth, the population setup and wealth of resources. What are, in your view, the biggest challenges, but also the biggest opportunities that you see in Africa?
Right. For me, actually, Africa is in a rather difficult place at the moment, and we have quite a number of serious challenges. Let's start with security. Security and peace has been deteriorating in Africa over the last 10 years or so, which is really a major problem. We can see the problem in the Sahel has been going for some time, ungoverned spaces, and we see that extending to the Horn of Africa and East Africa, where Somalia is a real problem. We can see the internal problems in Ethiopia, and the number of people died there, which interestingly people are not paying attention. Sudan is completely disintegrating at the moment, and we have like 10 million refugees, some of them internally displaced, some in Chad, some in Egypt. It is a disaster. Libya has been broken and was never put together again. So we have a number of challenges really in that context. We managed to get through COVID, unfortunately, with some difficulties. And the problem with COVID actually was more financial than health. Fortunately, I don't know why, I'm not a medical doctor, but health-wise, we did not really suffer too much casualties. But there was a huge financial hit for Africa, and that led to some debt crisis. A number of African countries really facing some fiscal problems there. That's also a big challenge for us. We can see also sliding back in democracy. And that bad specter of military coups, which we thought is ended in the 80s and 90s, is coming back really seriously. And we have quite a number of recent military coups in Africa. And in my view, that only way due to misrule and bad governance by the civilians. So these are a number of challenges. Climate is hitting Africa hard, which is really unfortunate, and we have some low resilience actually. And that's an issue for us. Unfortunately, we're struggling with that. Then, of course, the big elephant in the room is the issue of development, how to move forward. And infrastructure, power. 600 million people in Africa without power. How can you have development without power. You cannot. So we have really quite a lot of challenges, unfortunately, and there's some strong headwinds actually, at a time when the world around us is also not in a good place.
Thank you, and also to have this broad-ranging set of issues. We will come back to some of this in a minute. It just reminded when you were speaking that we actually had a previous conversation online at the beginning of COVID, and
Yes.
I will invite the viewers to actually look back, because already back in the spring of 2020, I remember that you warned about the financial dimension of the crisis, as much as the health side of it, which of course proved sadly correct and prescient. Let us move on to one of the key core focuses of your foundation's work, which is governance, and the need to really deep dive into what works and what doesn't work in African governance. I would perhaps ask you, if possible, to zoom in on the democratic aspect, which you touched upon briefly before. Let's call it democratic backsliding, if we want to use a catchphrase. How do you assess this problem?
It is really a serious problem, and you can see a number of factors which help really this rising in autocratic rules or military coups, etc. It seems worldwide we're going through an era where strong men are in the rise everywhere. You look around you and you can see strong men popping everywhere, becoming fashionable. And you have those leaders in Africa who look and say, well, why not me? If is that button acceptable worldwide? And so it is really a global problem, the rise of, I call it the rise of strong men. And it's very worrying, but it is happening. The problem with democracy, and I sometimes I prefer the word participation of people than democracy, because in many people, especially in the West, democracy meant that every 4 years people stand in queues to go and cast their votes. And then we have an election and we have a winner and all is fine, and we congratulate the winner and we say democracy is there. I think that is a little bit shallow because without institutions, without transparency, how clean is the vote register? Is that clean? In my country, my home country, Sudan, Bashir, the terrible dictator, he won elections, but the register was never made public, and when people saw it later, it was full of dead people or people who never born, and election is won even before the election day. So they don't need to beat up people at the polling station because it doesn't matter. And then people sign off and say, fine, it's a peaceful election. The issue really is participation, the space for civil society, the space for opposition, etc. And that's what we need to focus on, really. Then beside that, we look at governance. We see governance as a basket of public goods governments need to deliver to people. Participation or democracy and rights, etc., is one aspect. But there are other aspects too which are important, because at the end, people cannot eat democracy. You cannot have it for dinner. You have kids and children, you need to feed those people. So development is very important. Education is important, health is important, financial management, corruption, transparency. There's a lot of other issues which are safety of people. can my kids walk in the street safely? This is are all also important aspect, and we should sometimes in the West, we are laser focused on the issue of democracy. Do people go and vote every year or not? Excuse me, that's not enough. Really, we need to look at the whole basket of deliverable, and that is really important. So that's why we produce the index, where we measure over 100 parameters to cover all these areas, because we need to deliver all of that. And, so anyway, that's what we think about.
Yes, and I mean, you're absolutely right that in fact, even in the West, we have increasingly this fascination with the strong men on the one hand, which is connected to the levels and modes of participation. And sometimes we seem to either forget or willfully ignore all that happens in between.
Yeah.
And both at the level of institutions and intermediate bodies, and of issues that willingly or not, don't necessarily depend on the vote. They need to happen irrespective of that. And
People need to eat.
People need to eat. People need to eat. Let us try to delve into some of these issues that are related, and particularly I'm thinking about climate change.
Yeah.
And there the paradox or the dilemma is that Africa, if you like, is disproportionately affected by climate change, a problem that they understandably will say, we were not part of causing.
Yeah.
So where do you see this also in relation, of course, to resource management and energy? And also, if I may bring this factor in, how and if the European Union and European countries can work together with Africa on the issue of climate change.
Yeah, Fabrizio, this is a very, very important point, and also really an area which we hope our European friends do understand where we come from. When it comes to climate, we are really the victims, not the perpetrator of the climate. And it looks hypocritical many times when Europeans lecture us about the need to be green and to be, because you say, excuse me, we emit maybe 3.5% of the carbon every year, but we think same amount or even more. I think Africa already is net zero. So the people who need to deal with this problem are the people who emitted all this stuff before and continue to emit. Look, on average, every American person, man, woman, child, emits like 16 tons per year. Every European, every Chinese put out between 6 and 7 tons per year. Most African countries, they emit less than half ton or 1 ton per year. So let us deal, that is the issue here, is not the, so that's really important, and people need to understand that. Secondly, maybe people don't know this, but there are 22 countries in Africa where the major source of their power is renewable. 22 countries, almost half of our countries, which is much more than any other continent, because we use a lot of hydropower, solar power, etc. So people need to understand that. So we are not like saying we want to pollute. No, we are trying really our best to remain good boys here. But people also need to understand that we have 600 million people in Africa without power. If you don't have power, you don't have life. You don't have jobs, you don't have education, you don't have health, you don't have anything. You cannot talk development if you don't have life. Europeans cannot live one day without power. Imagine no power around. I mean, you cannot live. So that has to be dealt with, because that power means development. We need to understand that. And people should not create a false trade-off between green and development, climate and development. We need both, and people need to understand that. I was shocked when in Glasgow, some 30-odd well-meaning European institutions and banks signed this document which says we're not going to invest anymore or support any investment in Africa when it comes to fossil and gas. And we say, excuse me, how can you do that? Those are well-meaning people, but unfortunately stupid people. And this is the problem. I worry a lot about well-meaning friends who are not smart enough, because they need to understand that we need to sort out, we need clean cooking in Africa. 900 million people in Africa suffer because of the cooking, or what you use for cooking is wood. And the smoke resulting from that affecting the health of them. 500,000 women die of respiratory diseases because of this. That's had to be dealt with. We need gas. People can have this cylinder there to cook cleanly and less damaging to the environment, because this wood is damaging. Burning wood is damaging, and deforestation is damaging. This is something we need to pay attention to. And we need also to build resilience in Africa to deal with climate change. So that is really important for us. So this argument of adaptation and mitigation, etc., need to think about it really in a more careful way.
And I think this is, also giving the concrete examples on cooking. I know you're just arriving from an important meeting in Paris, precisely addressing this issue. It reminded me, in fact, and this is perhaps encouraging, that there is, in fact, a new generation in Africa of leaders, activists. I remember a recent BBC Hard Talk, where some of your leaders are actually walking the talk of what needs to be done, using some of the same language that we Europeans use, but in a sense countering the argument and explaining in a language we can understand what needs to be done.
Fabrizio, we need to be honest and frank. And that has always been a problem between Africa and Europe. We're talking past each other. And when we meet in political meeting, we are too polite. Too polite. We don't need to be polite.
No.
If you want to be real friends, we need to be honest and frank. You need to understand my pain, and I need to understand your pain. Then we can really find a way to move forward. I need to know your priorities. You need to understand my priorities, and that's how we can really build a healthy relationship. And this is the problem in the relationship between Africa and Europe. That's why actually 3 years ago, together with another European foundation, Friends of Europe, we formed the Africa-Europe Foundation to provide a safe space for Europeans and Africans, policymakers, civil society, business people, etc., to meet and speak frankly, in a safe place. So it's not shaming or posturing, it is an honest discussion.
Absolutely.
And that has been very useful, actually. And we hope to have a better understanding.
Yes, and to overcome the mistrust
exactly.
that comes, absolutely. And this actually leads us to the next topic, which is very related, and it's, I know, very dear to your heart, which is financing Africa's development. How do we do that? And to start with, I would probably ask you to tell us a little bit about the problem of, first of all, of illicit financial flows depriving Africa of resources. If you can describe the problem a little bit for our audience and how it impacts Africa's development. And again, I would invite you also here to look at the European dimension. What can Europe do to help address this problem?
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for raising this question, because it's absent, unfortunately, from our dialogue. Illicit financial flows is a problem which have been suffering from for many years. For the last 20, 30 years, we have been always raising that issues, and nobody is listening. Basically, it is profit shifting and mispricing. In my view, it is a crime. It's not yet a crime. We hope it becomes a crime. But it is a behavior of corporates which effectively avoid paying taxes in Africa and shift profits out of Africa and then mispricing products in Africa. According to the United Nations, this is something like $90 billion a year lost in Africa. According to American academic research at Amherst University, it's 107 billion. Choose your number. Of course, it's difficult to have a precise number of a problem of that dimension, but it's somewhere, let's say, in the middle, 100 billion a year. So Africa uses $100 billion a year in illicit financial flows, and the culprits here is corporates, European corporates, American corporates, etc. And the total amount of aid to Africa is 53 billion, around that number. So African says, excuse me, who is funding whom? You're taking 100 million and you're giving me 53 million. Keep your 53 million and give me 100 million. I think I will be better off.
Better off, yeah.
So that's an issue need to be done. And actually, it was arguments falling on deaf ears. Nobody cares about this. And then some European countries woke up one morning and they said, oh, this, Google, Apple, Starbucks, those companies are not paying taxes here. They're having huge sales here, but they book the sales somewhere else. And what shall we do about this? And immediately, and we said, excuse me, we have been saying this issue about all the corporates. It's not only the tech companies, and that is a problem. And in a way, we are happy that we are stung now by the same problem we have. Can we act? And I was very glad in the last Africa-Europe summit in Brussels a couple of years ago, which I attended, fortunately, and I raised the issue there, and I was very delighted that they included that in the communique, that there is a commitment to do something about this illicit financial flow. We need to look at the way the corporates are acting, and we need to put a play, somewhere. G7 asked what's called I forgot the institute in Paris for developing countries to look at base erosion and tax. So there is this issue now. People started to wake up and to see what shall we do about it. So we hope people deal with that issue. It is a big problem.
It is.
Financing Africa is a big... Look, what Africa needs is not aid. What Africa needs is investment. This is the real thing we need, because that's what creates jobs, creates prosperity. At the moment, there's a number of areas there which is really hindering that. Every time I go to a conference, every time I go somewhere, people say, oh, okay, private sector will come, private sector will invest. That's where the money is. It's not the public institutions. It is the private sector who has trillions of dollars to invest. Africa needs investment, but it's not happening. You know why, Fabrizio, it's not happening? And it will never happen, because it's the cost of capital. The cost of capital is the main problem for us in Africa. If I'm trying to invest in Africa, and I sat in a number of investment committee, investors are looking for 25% return on capital every year. How can you have a project where you have 25% return on capital? You cannot. But why? You say, oh, is Africa risk? Look at the way Africa is graded. I mean, it's graded as sub-investment grade, almost all African countries. And so the cost of capital. sovereign, I mean, if the governments want to borrow money, they have to pay interest rate of 14%. Now, this is the kind of interest rate the mafia maybe will charge you. You know, so how can a government invest, borrow money at 14% or 15%? And of course, after a while, they'll be in trouble.
Yeah.
That's why, very interesting thing, the other day, there was an article, I think it was the FT, about the African countries in debt distress. And the argument was there are few countries where the debt to GDP ratio is approaching 60%, and this is the, red sign and alarm bells start ringing. I looked at the G7. What is the debt ratio, average debt ratio of the G7 country? At that time, I looked at it, I think last year, it was 137%. So, if you are a member of the G, if you are a very developed country, debt to GDP ratio 137% is fine. You are not in debt distress. If you're an African countries and your debt ratio is 60%, you are in debt distress, you need to call the IMF. Where is the ambulance? We need to, the patient is in a critical condition. But the root cause here is that the cost of the 60% debt in Africa is much higher than the cost of the debt of those guys who borrow at 137%. So the cost of capital in Africa is a serious problem. And that's something we need to address.
And this brings us closer to the conclusion of our conversation, which I think understandably should really focus on the future. And at the risk of being a little bit self-serving, here at the School of Transnational Governance, we have been hosting a number of young professionals and students from Africa, and in fact, a large portion of our viewers are from Africa. And I would like to ask you, what is the role, in your view, of training and education in reshaping the debate between Europe and Africa?
That's very important. That's very important. And I think we need to focus on the young generation. In Africa, I think the future of Africa depends on our young generation. They're better educated than us, more global than us, and those people coming with clear ideas about democracy, governance, etc., etc. That's the future, and we need to focus on that. And we need also to focus on the young people in Europe. And it's important to have some interaction there, to reframe the discussion from the poisonous stuff about, the resentment on one side and the guardianship from the other side. We need to have a more healthy relationship. And we need to frame the discussions. I mean, you look at migration. I don't want to go, it's a long subject, we don't have time for that. The current discussion on migration is poisonous. People need to look at it from a completely different angle. And in Africa, people think that we're losing some of our best talented people. We brought them up, we educated them, it cost us a lot of money, and then they leave us to go and serve in other countries and to pay taxes there, not in our countries. I mean, that is a brain drain for us, and etc. In Europe, we are a fortress Europe, we need to protect our borders. Those guys coming to Islamicize or do what, destroy our culture and our, we need to have a different kind of discussion. And Europe is going to need young people because, as it happened, the demography of Europe and the demography in Africa is actually very interesting. They are different.
Oh, yeah.
And it can produce an interesting really relationship. The taxpayer base here is shrinking. People getting much older. Who's going to pay their pensions? Who are going to, provide health services and is needed for old people? The span of life is 87 and rising. Who's going to deal with those people? So you're going to need some people to come on. But unfortunately, politicians are afraid of having the right discussion. Young people are not afraid. And people need to have this kind of honest, robust discussion between themselves instead of just pointing finger and then have this resentment in one side. And so let's have a good discussion.
Absolutely. And if I can end on a uplifting note, we have had over the past few years here dozens of young professionals, mid-career professionals from all walks of life in quite literally all the 54 member states of the African Union. And what I've always found extremely encouraging is that we call it training, but it's not really training. I mean, they come here with knowledge, with a desire to share their knowledge. And of course, this on the one hand requires us to be in a listening mode, which is a precondition, but it also creates the premise for a wonderful conversation, because we in Europe need to listen and to have that conversation.
This is a wonderful statement. And I really love your university and what you're trying to do. We need more of you.
Thank you so much, Mo, and we all look forward to the lecture. I want to thank the viewers of Governance this week for joining us and for tuning in. Till next time, goodbye.